Okay, let's take a look at the case of Pellagra. Sometimes people say Pellagra, but we'll say Pellagra. Pellagra was first reported in 1863. By 1912, there were 25,000 cases. In 1915, Joseph Goldberger began investigating the disease. Here he is over here. The symptoms of Pellagra were dermatitis, and we'll take a look at what that looks like, and skin rash, dementia, where the mind begins to fail, and diarrhea. The skin, as we'll see, became reddened, scaly, crusty, and infected. This is what Pellagra looked like back then. An old photo. You can see the dermatitis here, and the rashes would be on the hands and the back and other places. Here's a more recent photo, and another case down here. Death occurred in 40% of the cases, and by 1950 there were 30,000 deaths from Pellagra. Now, at the time, most thought it was infectious, caused by some germ, spread by some unknown means. But keep that in mind. The prevailing view at the time was that it was infectious and therefore contagious. Right? You could catch it from somebody who had Pellagra. But Goldberger disagreed, and it's interesting to note why he disagreed. First of all, doctors and nurses never seemed to get the disease, yet they would care for people with Pellagra, and they would be cleaning and giving aid to people with these rashes that would be infected, but the doctors and nurses never got the disease. In addition, only rural poor people seemed to get the disease. Rural meaning they lived out in the countryside, they were poor. You didn't see the people in the wealthy class get it, or in urban areas. It was often found in prisons and orphanages. So in Goldberger's mind, he wondered whether this might be a dietary deficiency instead of a contagious disease, an infectious disease. Here's a map of the United States by the time of World War I, looking at some of the soldiers and where they came from. This would be the frequency of the disease, and you can see it was more common in the South, in the rural South, in poverty conditions. Okay, so Goldberger set about to test his hypothesis that Pellagra was caused by dietary deficiency. So he went to one of the orphanages. Here's a cartoon diagram of what he attempted to do. So here we have the orphans over here, and let's say these three with the unhappy faces here, they're suffering from Pellagra. Now, the idea in Goldberger's mind was they were suffering from Pellagra because they were receiving a poor diet. Right? So what he did was he said, well, what if, right, we just supply a nutritious diet to the orphans here? Could that return them to health, and could it lower the frequency of Pellagra in the orphanage? So what he did was he supplied them with a nutritious diet, including milk, eggs, meat, and beans. And over time, what he found is, sure enough, there was a reduction in the frequency of Pellagra. If we think about this sort of from the experimental design point of view, the orphans back here in time in the past are sort of like the control condition because they were receiving a poor diet. So we're going to think of the factor of interest as a nutritious diet. So he's going to supply the nutritious diet, and then that becomes then these people over here getting the nutritious diet, then they become in a sense the experimental condition because they are receiving the factor of interest. So the variable in the experiment is the nutritious diet. Back here in the past, this group, they're lacking the variable, they're lacking the nutritious diet, so we'll call them the control condition. And over time, those orphans are turned into the experimental condition. They are receiving the factor of interest, the nutritious diet. For Goldberger, this is a great success, right? So you could take some sick orphans here and make them healthy again by giving them a better diet. Now, that was good evidence, but he went on to do further research. And here was his famous prison study. So he got the cooperation of a prison, and he got some of the prisoners to volunteer for the study. And if they did volunteer and they lasted the length of the study, they would be set free. So there was definitely something in it for the prisoners to take part in the study. And he set up a more sort of controlled experiment in this case. So for some of the prisoners, they were assigned to the control condition, and for other prisoners, assigned to the experimental condition. And remember here, we're going to define our variable here as supplying a nutritious diet. So if we think about the experimental condition, they're going to be supplied with a good diet. In the control condition, they're going to be denied a nutritious diet. In fact, at the time, the prisoners here started off healthy, and so here what Goldberger wanted to do was to see whether depriving prisoners of a healthy diet could actually cause pellagra in the control condition. Right? That would have been his prediction. The restricted diet consisted of biscuits, mush, grits, gravy, syrup, coffee, sugar, cornbread, collards, and sweet potatoes. So the prisoners thought, yeah, okay, that's easy enough to win their freedom. They just have to eat this meal. But the ones in the control condition, they were at risk. In Goldberger's mind, they were at risk to developing pellagra. Now, in fact, after 6 months of this study, Goldberger began to worry. After a couple months, nothing was happening. But sure enough, prisoners in the control condition did start to get the rashes. And within weeks of the first rash in this group, others began to get the rash as well. And Goldberger had succeeded in demonstrating that if you deprive people of a nutritious diet, you can cause pellagra. If we apply this case to the if and then format, or rather we apply the format to this case, then we have something like this. If good nutrition causes health, so the flip side of that is bad nutrition causes pellagra. The variable then here is going to be the factor of interest, the nutrition, the good nutrition, that's going to be our A. And some prisoners are deprived of nutrients, so we're blocking A, while others are supplied with nutrients, we're supplying A. Okay, the deprived prisoners are going to be the control condition because they're lacking the nutritious diet. Supplied prisoners are going to be the experimental. Then the nutrition deprived prisoners should get sick, and the nutrition supplied prisoners should remain healthy. The result, nutrition deprived prisoners do get pellagra, nutrition supplied prisoners do not. Since the result matches the prediction, the hypothesis is supported. Right? And down here, just a reminder how we use this format to test the hypothesis. If the results match the prediction, the hypothesis is supported. If the results do not match the prediction, the hypothesis is weakened. Now, Goldberger had difficulty convincing others that pellagra was a dietary deficiency. So remember, the kind of word on the street at the time, the consensus, the predominant view was that pellagra was infectious. So even though he did his orphan study and the prison study, he felt he had to go further to convince notable people, the general public, and other researchers that pellagra was a dietary deficiency. Here's what he did. This is something that probably would not happen today. He had what he called filth parties. Goldberger, his wife, and friends experimented on themselves. So what they did was, from pellagra patients, they injected themselves or swallowed the blood, sputum, skin, urine, and feces of pellagra patients. Right? So they did this not just once, several times. Again, what they were doing was purposely exposing themselves to whatever infectious agent might be in the pellagra patient. Of course, for Goldberger did not believe that pellagra was infectious. So in his mind, he did not think he was exposing himself to danger, the danger of getting pellagra here. Nevertheless, they had 7 filth parties, and they never got the disease. Nobody at these filth parties ever got the disease, even though they were consuming or having injected into them blood, sputum, skin, urine, and feces from pellagra patients. Right? The filth parties made the news. in time, people began to be persuaded that pellagra was a dietary deficiency. But it was 8 years after Goldberger's death that the missing dietary ingredient was finally discovered. And we call it niacin, or vitamin B3. And so at that time, vitamin B3 was added to flour so that anything using flour would have this essential vitamin. And because of that effort, pellagra disappeared from America. So Joseph Goldberger, he is noted in the history books as doing some good science. The view of the day was that it was an infectious disease. He did some clever observations and good experiments to demonstrate that pellagra was not infectious. It was a dietary deficiency. And the disease called pellagra disappeared because of the work in Goldberger and others to identify this important vitamin.